There is something deeply unsettling about the way history repeats itself. Not in the rise of empires, and not in the fall of nations, but in the minds of the men who hold absolute power. At the very top of the world, where no one can challenge you, where your words become law and your decisions shape the fate of millions, something begins to change inside a man. Silence becomes heavier, trust becomes fragile, and slowly, almost invisibly, fear begins to take control. This is not the kind of fear we recognize in everyday life. It is not the fear of enemies, or of war, or even of death. It is something far more dangerous. It is the fear of being exposed, the fear of losing everything, the fear that someone, somewhere, knows the truth. Men like Adolf Hitler did not simply appear as monsters. They were shaped over time by doubt, by insecurity, and by a past they could never fully escape. And long before him, on the other side of the world, another man stood at the peak of absolute power. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, a ruler who commanded armies and reshaped history, yet could not escape his own inner fears. Different worlds, different centuries, different empires, yet the same pattern continues to emerge. Because when a man gains absolute power, he begins to see the world not as it is, but as something dangerous. Every whisper sounds like a secret. Every ally feels uncertain. Every shadow carries the possibility of betrayal. And in that kind of world, trust cannot survive. Only control remains. This is where power stops being a symbol of strength and becomes a quiet curse. A curse that turns closeness into danger, loyalty into suspicion, and even family into something to be feared. This is not just a story about history. It is a pattern that has repeated itself across centuries, across cultures, and across the lives of the most powerful men who have ever lived. The question is not whether it happened. The question is why it always happens. There comes a moment in every empire when fear can no longer remain hidden. It begins quietly. A thought, a doubt, a question that refuses to disappear. And then, one night, it becomes action. In 1934, Adolf Hitler faced a problem he could no longer ignore. Not from enemies outside his regime, but from within it. Men who had once stood beside him, fought for him, believed in him. Among them was Ernst Röhm, a man who had helped build the very foundation of Hitler's rise. A loyal ally, a powerful figure, and someone who knew too much. To the outside world, there was no immediate threat. But inside Hitler's mind, the calculation was different. Trust had already collapsed, and once trust is gone, even loyalty becomes dangerous. That night, under the cover of darkness, orders were given, quietly, efficiently, without hesitation. Men were taken from their rooms. Some were still half asleep. Some did not even understand what was happening. There were no trials, no debates, no second chances, only decisions, cold, final decisions. The event would later be known as the Night of the Long Knives. But for those who lived through it, it was not a name. It was a moment when the line between ally and enemy disappeared forever. And far away, centuries earlier, another ruler faced the same invisible enemy. Qin Shi Huang did not trust the world he had conquered. He trusted even less the people who built it for him. When the Great Tomb was constructed, thousands of workers, craftsmen, and builders knew its secrets. They knew its structure, its paths, its hidden chambers, and that knowledge alone made them a threat. History tells us that many of them never left. They were sealed inside, buried with the very structure they had created, not because they had betrayed him, but because they could. And for a ruler consumed by fear, that possibility was enough. This is the moment where power reveals its true nature. not as strength, but as control, driven by fear. If we look closely, the fear that consumes powerful men does not begin at the height of their rule. It begins much earlier, in places they try their hardest to forget. For Adolf Hitler, that place was not a battlefield, and not a political stage. It was his own family. He was born into uncertainty. His father, Alois, carried a name that was not originally his own, a past that was unclear, and a lineage that could not be fully traced. In a society obsessed with identity, blood, and origin, this was not a small flaw. It was a silent weakness. As Hitler grew older, whispers followed him. Questions about his ancestry, rumors that somewhere in his bloodline there might have been something he would later come to despise. We cannot say for certain what he believed. But what matters is this: he never truly felt secure in who he was. And when a man builds his entire identity on the idea of purity, any doubt becomes unbearable. It is in that quiet space, between truth and fear, that something begins to grow. Not anger, not ambition, but suspicion. He begins to look backward, into his own past, not with curiosity, but with fear. Fear that something hidden might surface. Fear that someone else might discover what he cannot control. And so, slowly, he starts to reshape reality around him. Not publicly at first, but privately, silently, carefully. And on the other side of history, centuries earlier, another man walked through the same darkness. Qin Shi Huang, a ruler who had conquered kingdoms, unified lands, and commanded absolute obedience. Yet in the quiet of the night, surrounded by walls he had built himself, he too could not escape a single thought. What if everything he built could be taken away? What if someone knew his weakness? What if the world he controlled was not as stable as it appeared? And so, like all men who fear what they cannot control, he turned inward, watching, questioning, doubting, not just his enemies, but everyone. And this is where the transformation begins, not from power, but from fear hidden beneath it. After the purge, something inside a man does not return to normal. It changes. At first, it is subtle, almost unnoticeable. A longer pause before speaking, a slightly tighter expression, a habit of looking over the shoulder, even when no one is there. For Adolf Hitler, the night of blood did not bring peace. It brought silence, a strange, heavy silence that followed him everywhere. Those who once stood beside him were gone. Their voices disappeared, their presence erased. And yet, in the quiet moments, it was as if they had never truly left. Late at night, when the room grew still, he would sit alone. No speeches, no crowds, no applause, just the ticking of time and his own thoughts. His eyes would linger on the shadows in the room, the corners where light could not fully reach. And for a brief moment, something would power does not always reveal itself in public. Sometimes it closes the doors and begins in silence. By 1934, Adolf Hitler was no longer an outsider. He was chancellor. He had the crowds, the symbols, the momentum. But there was one problem he could not ignore. Ernst Röhm, a man who had stood beside him from the beginning, a man who helped build the movement when it was still fragile, uncertain, almost invisible. Röhm was not just an ally, he was powerful, too powerful. The Sturmabteilung, the SA, had grown into a force that no longer waited for orders. They believed in a second revolution, one that would go beyond politics, one that would reshape the state itself. And that idea made others nervous. The army, the industrial elites, even those who supported Hitler, began to question what might come next. But for Hitler, the threat was not only political, it was personal. Röhm knew him, not the leader the world saw, but the man behind the image. And that kind of knowledge cannot be controlled. It can only be removed. In late June, Hitler made a decision, not publicly, not officially, but quietly. He would act. He would move first, before doubt could become resistance, before loyalty could turn into something else. On the morning of June 30th, 1934, he arrived, unexpected, unannounced. The atmosphere was calm, too calm. Men who believed they were still trusted, still protected, were about to learn otherwise. Doors opened, names were called, rooms were entered, one by one. There was no chaos, no shouting, only confusion, a slow realization that something had changed, and that it had already gone too far to stop. Ernst Röhm was arrested. He was given a choice, not a real one, a gesture, a moment to decide how the story would end. But the ending had already been written. Elsewhere, across Germany, the same pattern repeated. Different rooms, different faces, the same silence, the same outcome. By the time it was over, the message was clear. Power does not tolerate equals, and those who stand too close eventually become shadows that must be erased. In the West, power tightened its grip in silence. In the East, thousands of years earlier, it dug into the earth, deep, patient, relentless. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, had done what no one before him could do. He unified the land. He imposed order. He forced history to move in a single direction. But there was one force he could not command: death. And the more absolute his power became, the less acceptable that truth felt. He searched for answers, elixirs, rituals, anything that could delay the inevitable. But fear does not fade when power grows. It sharpens, it becomes specific, it becomes urgent. And so, beneath the ground, a different kind of empire began to take shape. Not for the living, but for what might come after. Workers arrived in waves, craftsmen, laborers, men who understood stone, earth, and structure. They did not build upward, they built downward, layer by layer, into compacted soil and timber frames, corridors, chambers, passages that would never see daylight again. The work was precise, repetitive, endless, and the deeper they went, the quieter it became. Above them, the world continued, but below, time felt different, slower, heavier. As the structure neared completion, another problem emerged: knowledge. Too many people knew too much, too many paths, too many entrances, too many secrets, and secrets cannot be allowed to leave. The decision was not announced. It did not need to be. Orders moved quietly, through ranks, through whispers, through understanding, and one by one, those who had built the emperor's final domain were no longer permitted to leave it. Doors were sealed. Passages were closed. Earth returned to where it had been moved. From above, nothing looked different. No sign of what remained below. No trace of the voices that once filled those chambers. Only silence. A silence so complete that it became part of the design. Because in the mind of a man who feared death, control did not end with life. It had to extend beyond it, even if that meant burying everything. That made it possible. If Qin Shi Huang feared what comes after death, Zhu Yuanzhang feared what stands beside him while he is still alive. He did not inherit power. He fought for it. He rose from hunger, from loss, from a world where survival was never guaranteed. And men like that do not forget, even when they sit on a throne, especially then. In the early years of the Ming Dynasty, the empire was stable. Order had been restored. The enemies were gone. But something else remained: memory. The faces of those who had once stood beside him. Generals, advisors, men who had shared hardship, and knew exactly how he had risen. That knowledge was no longer comfort. It was risk, because what had been built together could, in another moment, be taken apart, not by strangers, but by those who understood it best. At first, the signs were small, questions asked more than once, reports reviewed again and again. Silence where there had once been trust. Then came distance, fewer conversations, fewer invitations, eyes that no longer met for long. And then, decisions. Names recorded, connections traced, families noted, not just the man, but everything around him. Because removing one threat was never enough. It had to be complete, absolute, so that nothing remained that could return later. Orders moved quietly, not in the open, but through structure, through authority, through certainty. And one by one, those who had once stood closest to power began to disappear from it. Homes emptied, courtyards silent, doors closed, no public explanation, no visible resistance, only absence, a growing absence, until the court itself felt different, quieter, safer, perhaps, but also colder, because in a world where loyalty had once meant survival, it now meant nothing at all. And in the mind of a man who had fought his way to the top, trust was not a bond. It was a weakness, one that could not be allowed to exist. Not anymore. 3 men, 3 different worlds, 3 different centuries. And yet, when power reached its highest point, they all began to see the same thing. Not enemies from afar, but danger, standing close. Adolf Hitler did not fall because of foreign threats. He turned inward and removed those who had helped him rise. Qin Shi Huang did not lose control of his empire. He feared what would remain after him and buried those who knew too much. Zhu Yuanzhang did not face rebellion at his peak. He looked at loyalty and saw uncertainty. Different actions, different decisions, but the same pattern. Because power, at its absolute form, does not see the world the way others do. It changes distance. It changes meaning. A friend becomes a variable. A supporter becomes a possibility. And a possibility becomes a risk. Or the closer someone stands to power, the more clearly they can see it. And in the mind of someone who cannot afford to be seen, that closeness becomes dangerous. So the solution is always the same. Not confrontation, not explanation, but removal. Quiet, controlled, final. And once it begins, it does not stop at one name or one decision. It expands until the space around power is empty enough to feel safe again. But safety, at that level, comes with a cost. Because when there is no one left to question you, there is also no one left to trust. And in that silence, power reaches its purest form, absolute, unchallenged, and completely alone. Pass across his face, not anger, not power, but something far more fragile. Doubt. What if one of them had been right? What if loyalty had simply been misunderstood? But the thought never stayed for long, because doubt, for a man like him, was dangerous. So he buried it, deeper than the bodies, deeper than the past, and replaced it with control. More control, stronger control. Because if everything is controlled, then nothing can go wrong. But the mind does not forget so easily. And far away, across centuries, Qin Shi Huang walked through his palace at night. The torches flickered along the wooden walls, casting shadows that moved like silent figures. He did not speak. He did not need to. His footsteps echoed through empty halls, each step reminding him of something he could not escape. The men who built his empire the men who knew too much, the men who were no longer alive. And yet, in the darkness, it was as if they were still there, watching, waiting. He would stop, just for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he had heard something, a whisper, a movement. But when he turned, there was nothing, only the walls he had built, only the silence he had created. And in that silence, a realization slowly took shape. The more power a man holds, the less he trusts the world around him, and the less he trusts the world, the more alone he becomes, until one day, there is no one left to trust at all, not even himself. There is a point where fear no longer feels like something unusual. It becomes normal. For most men, fear appears only in moments of danger. It comes, and then it fades. But for men who hold absolute power, fear does not fade. It stays, it grows, and eventually, it becomes a way of thinking. Zhu Yuanzhang, the founding emperor of the Ming dynasty, was not born into power. He came from hunger, from loss, from a life where survival itself was uncertain. He had seen people betray each other for a single meal. He had seen loyalty break under pressure, and he had learned one lesson very early. Trust is fragile. When he finally rose to the throne, when the empire stood stable under his rule, when the battles were over and the enemies were gone, that lesson did not disappear. It became stronger. At night, when the palace grew quiet, he would sit alone, much like the men before him. No war to fight, no rebellion in sight. And yet, his mind would not rest. His eyes would move slowly across the room, from one corner to another, as if measuring the distance between safety and danger. He would think of the men who helped him rise, the generals who fought beside him, the officials who stood loyal through chaos. And then, slowly, the thought would come. What if they turned? What if the same strength that built the empire could also destroy it? His expression would not change. His breathing remained steady. But inside, something shifted. A quiet decision, not driven by anger, not driven by revenge, but by calculation. Cold, precise, unavoidable. And once that decision was made, it did not stop at one name, or two, or 10. It spread, like a shadow that grows without sound. Families disappeared, names erased, entire bloodlines gone. Not because they acted, but because they might. And that was enough. Because in a mind shaped by fear, possibility is more dangerous than reality. And in that world, no one is truly innocent. History does not repeat itself in the way we expect. It does not copy names. It does not recreate faces. But it repeats something far more subtle. Patterns. Across centuries, across cultures, across men who never knew each other. The same decisions begin to appear. Not at the beginning. Not when power is uncertain. But at the very moment it becomes absolute. That is when something changes. Not in the world, but in the person holding it. Because power, at that level, does not simply give control. It removes limits. And without limits, there is nothing left to push against, nothing left to question, nothing left to resist. And slowly, the world becomes quieter. Not because it is peaceful, but because there is no one left, willing to speak. Hitler did not lose everything overnight. Qin Shi Huang did not fail to build his empire. Zhu Yuanzhang did not fall to rebellion. They succeeded, completely. And that is precisely when the silence began. A silence built from absence, from distance, from decisions made one step at a time, each one reasonable on its own, each one justified, until there was nothing left but power itself, and the man holding it, alone. Because in the end, power does not destroy its enemies first. It removes its equals, then its allies, and finally, it isolates the one who remains. Perhaps that is the real pattern. Not the rise, not the rule, but the ending. A room that grows quieter over time, a space that becomes larger as the people inside it disappear, and a single figure standing at the center of it all. If history leaves us anything, it is not just stories of what happened, but warnings of what happens when no one is left close enough to be trusted. So the question is not only about them, it is about the nature of power itself, and whether any human being, placed at the very top, could truly choose a different path. What do you think? Would it be different? Or would the silence come anyway? If this story made you pause, take a moment to share your thoughts below. And if you find yourself drawn to these quiet patterns of history, you already know where to find the next one.